The age of exploration is one that I think all of us have learned about before, but it has different names, right? One of the names that I think is often most commonly given to it, the age of discovery, is one that we always associate with it, and so certainly associate with people like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, the conquistadors. Francisco Pizarro, Hernan Cortez, De Soto from Spain, Henry Cabot, who sailed for the British, and so on and so on. But I often use, and I try to use most often, the name the age of exploration, because I don't necessarily, I don't see it as an age of discovery, right? And we know the story, right? There are millions of Native Americans who live in North and South America prior to the European arrival. So obviously there's nothing here newly discovered by the human species, simply newly discovered by the Europeans. So when we talk about this, right, it's important for us to remember how we refer to things in history. And again, history is an evolving subject. So when we look at these ideas, what we called something, when I was in school in the 1990s, those names change, and for good reason. And that I think is something that we need to keep in mind here. So we are going to be jumping into this today, and we're going to start by looking at another somebody who you probably have not yet heard of. And that person's name is Zheng He. Now, Zheng He was a Chinese mariner, and this map isn't terribly great here, but I think it is still helpful, right? So Zheng He travels from China. He's a member of, he's a sailor within the Ming Dynasty, and he sails throughout the Indian Ocean basin, traveling to show how great the Chinese emperors were. And he brings gifts and tributes, and he travels in massive, massive ships. So this is an image of a ship called the Tribute Ship that Zheng He traveled in. This boat would have been something close to about 450 feet long by about 100 feet wide. And for comparison, right, so this would have been his flagship. There would have been about a dozen to 20 of these on any of his expeditions. And the purpose of these really was just to show how great the emperors were, right? The size here matters, and they're trying to show that off. But when you look at this in comparison to other ships, right, so the boat here this is a 2-scale rendering, these are both to scale, of Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, right? So in comparison, Columbus's ship barely reaches about 100 feet. It's in the 90s in terms of length. And width, you're talking something probably 25 to 30 feet wide. So you're not really talking about a massive ship, right? But again, this is to show how great the Chinese emperors were. So when we look at the reasons for exploration, and particularly when we talk about somebody like Zheng He again is really looking, he's not looking to discover anything, because for hundreds of years, and we'll talk more about this in a coming lecture, people have been traveling in the Indian Ocean basin. But there are goods that are really important here, right? So there's nothing to discover, but there's stuff to trade. And for China, for the emperors, for Zheng He, bringing goods to those far-off places shows their benevolence and their greatness. But also receiving those and establishing trade partnerships is important to preserving that greatness, right? So there's sort of two pieces to that. But when we look at people like the Europeans, right, why do they want to trade? And the reason they want to trade and the reason they want to explore comes really in sort of two major forms. The first major form is faster access to Asia and the Asian commodities, right? China, Japan, India, Indonesia, the east coast of Africa, all provide really luxurious commodities that the Europeans desire, whether it's wood, and ivory from Africa, whether it's spices and teas from China. There is a desire to attract and get those goods. Now, there's also another sort of hiccup here. In 1453, the city of Constantinople was sacked by the Ottoman Turks. Now, Constantinople is a city which is in modern-day Turkey. It's currently the city of Istanbul. When it is sacked in 1453, prior to that, it had been the major hub, the sort of jumping-off point to sail things to Europe, particularly Southern Europe, and then into mainland Europe. So when it is sacked in 1453, the Europeans need a way to sort of avoid the hostile Ottoman Turks, and they're looking for a way to bypass that. The second major reason is to convert people, right? So if we look at documents that are from the period, right, primary source documents, right? So this is an excerpt from a journal entry by Christopher Columbus in August of 1492, and what you can see here, right? He mentions a desire to learn the disposition of the people and converting them to our holy faith, right? So again, that idea of conversion is on their mind. He's also looking for title. I might call myself Don, the High Admiral of Sea, the perpetual viceroy and governor of all the islands and continents I discover. He's looking for glory, gold, conquest, and all of that is part of his desire. So when we talk about this, right, we use this sort of acronym, the 3 Gs, right? Gold, glory, and God. Those are the desires of the Europeans when they travel and they explore. Now, when they look to do this, right, why in the 1400s, right? So we know one reason is that one reason that they do it is because of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The other reason is really a coming together of a lot of very helpful technologies, right? The first is the caravel, which is a type of sail that helps sail and ship that helps to navigate the water a bit more easily, right? So the sail is a triangular sail compared to a square sail, right? So basically what happens with a square sail, if the wind is not behind you, there's nothing much you can do. But with a square sail, you can almost turn it into sort of a wing, right? So if the wind is coming head on, you can use that to sort of push you down and propel you forward. And this is helpful, I think, to sort of understanding why the ships are smaller, right? They're using these sort of different types of technology. It is easier to do that on a smaller ship. And this also helps, obviously, prevent stagnation in the water. There's new compasses, gunpowder. But the last big thing is really political consolidation. Within Europe at this time, there is political consolidation, right? Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, who are the king and the queen of Spain in the 1490s, right, have a lot of money, and they are willing to take a gamble on Christopher Columbus, right? Now, when we were kids, we all learned that Columbus was crazy because he thought the world was flat. Now, that's not correct, right? For hundreds of years since the time of Ptolemy, in the early 300s, late 200s, everybody knew the world was round. Every educated person knew the world was round. But where Christopher Columbus was wrong, and many people thought he was crazy, was the size of the globe, right? He had a massive miscalculation and thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, right? So they thought that this mission was a suicide mission. Basically, if you go out and you sail with Columbus, you're inevitably going to die because he's going to take you out into the middle of the ocean and there's no food, there's no water, and that's it. But Ferdinand and Isabella had enough money because of political consolidation where they could put a gamble on Columbus. And they could say, you know what? We're wealthy enough where we're going to give you 3 ships, 100 guys. Good luck. And because they were so wealthy, the reward outweighed the risk. I've seen it described as, this was a gamble that like a rich person dropping $100 on a gamble, right? It's not terribly, it's not life-threatening or wealth-threatening. So we all know that Columbus ultimately bumps into the Americas, and he spurs off what we call the Columbian Exchange. So beginning around 1492, when Columbus first encounters South America or the Caribbean, this begins the intentional and unintentional transportation of goods, products, diseases, food stuff across the Atlantic Ocean, going both east and west. Now, there's some big impacts that this has, right? And again, this is a vague definition, but coming out of this, right, there's a couple of pieces, right? So we're going to start going from the Americas across to Europe and Africa and Asia, right? So a lot of these products are not terribly significant. Maybe it's better if I make this map a little larger, right? I mean, chocolate, pineapples, tobacco, pumpkins, right? These are not things that are sort of life-giving, right? These are not things that are going to fundamentally change people's dietary needs. Tobacco certainly is a carcinogen and causes many deaths. But the things that are very significant here are potatoes, corn, and sweet potatoes. These 3 products create massive changes to European diets, right? We all know that the Irish start planting a lot of potatoes, and those are never seen in Europe before. So the Irish start planting potatoes, and the basic calorie intake of Europeans goes up substantially, right? Potatoes can grow in very, very poor soil, so can corn. And because of that, as I say, the caloric intake increases substantially. And because people have more calories, they can survive illnesses and diseases better. And there's a population boom as a result of the potato, cassava, corn making its way into the European, African, and Asian diets. The big impact in the Americas, right, when we look at what comes from Europe and goes to the Americas, comes with diseases, right? Smallpox, the flu, tuberculosis, typhus, all of these illnesses going across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to the Americas has devastating impacts, right? Because of a separation of geography, continents, Native Americans had never encountered these illnesses before. That's also because they had never had domesticatable livestock, right? So cattle, sheep, pigs, horses don't exist in North America, South America prior to 1492. And when the Europeans encounter Native Americans and they exchange these illnesses, right, start breathing the air, touching people, this has devastating impacts. By some projections, 80 to 90% of Native Americans die from these illnesses. And this has a massive reduction of population for Native Americans, and it creates a situation where Europeans, because there are so few Europeans making the journey over, particularly by the 1600s, that there's going to need to labor sources, and for racial reasons, which we'll talk about, the Europeans go to Africa and capture slaves and bring them across the Atlantic Ocean. So when we look at this, right, the impact here has a positive impact largely in Europe, Africa, Asia, where there's a positive population growth. There's also a negative impact of the implementation of slavery in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. But then there's massive population decrease here in the Americas. So the Spanish government is the government that is largely involved in moving people across the Atlantic Ocean, at least initially in the 1500s, to explore North and South America. The British government, or I should say the English government, doesn't have the financial resources. There's consolidation that happens in the 1500s because of the Reformation. Again, we'll talk about that. That gives Britain a lot of money, but they don't have that money yet. And that's why they have to wait to the 1600s. But the Spanish government is the one that's involved here. Portugal, obviously, as well, too, and their establishment of Brazil. But for the Spanish, right, there's this kind of interesting situation where they send over conquistadors. So conquistadors were soldiers who came to the Americas to conquer, as their name would suggest, the territory. But their goal was really one of financial gain, right? So when we talk about people like Hernando Cortez or Francisco Pizarro, they come here seeking to conquer these territories. Basically, they take out a line of credit, and they get ships, they get soldiers, and they come to the Americas in order to conquer. And they basically get to keep all of the goods they get. They settle the territory for the king and the queen of Spain, right? So when Hernando Cortez arrives in Mexico and he conquers the Aztec, he claims Mexico, what becomes Mexico, for Isabella and Ferdinand. And he can keep 80% of the gold that he discovers. And he has to share it with the soldiers that he's brought over, right? They've already negotiated a rate. But 80% gets to stay with the conquistadors. The government takes back what is called the royal fifth, right? So the Spanish crown gets 5%, 1/5, 20% of all of the gold taken, right? And it's basically this idea that it's a sort of negotiated rate again, where the king and the queen get their money, but the conquistadors get their others, right? And we also have Francisco Pizarro and Atahualpa fighting in South America and what becomes Peru. And we see a massive annihilation of the Inca in terms of disease and political problems that helps Pizarro. Pizarro only comes with like 150 men, and he's able to conquer an army of about 80,000 soldiers. Again, disease, political problems create that ability. So by the time the Spanish establish their foothold, right, they set up what are called viceroyalties. So there's one here in New Spain. There's the viceroyalty of Peru. Up here in northern South America, there's going to be called the viceroyalty of Colombia. And then down here in what is today Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, there is the Rio de la Plata. So all of these ways to manage this territory exists here. Now, the treatment of Native Americans during this period was one of mass, not only are they dying from diseases and warfare, but they're also being treated awfully. So you can see, right, and I'm going to share this document with you here. So this is from a guy named Bartolome de las Casas. So de las Casas was a Franciscan priest who came to South America to minister to Native Americans. And he's illustrating in a book called On the Impact of the Columbian Exchange, the awful conditions that Native Americans are living in, right? So husbands and wives were together only once every 8 to 10 months. And when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. For this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. So you can see, right, that there is this sort of awful treatment where people are being overworked, their bodies are shutting down, and children are dying in massive numbers. Parents are dying from overwork and exhaustion. And then he also exaggerates, he has some really interesting drawings that are put into the book, right? So this is not an engraving done by him, but it was in his book of these Spaniards, just destroying Native Americans. The Europeans also establish a way to preserve a social structure that exists in Europe, right? So that one of the things they do is they want to give supremacy and primacy to the Spanish-born inhabitants, right? So if you are born in Spain and you come to North or South America, you are in this group called the Peninsulares. Now, this group would generally be the family, would come as a family, right? A husband and a wife and probably children. And they're called the Peninsulares because they are born on the peninsula, right? The Iberian Peninsula. These guys hold the highest jobs. They're the viceroys, the governors. They are the people who have the most power within the government. Below them are the Creoles. These are the children of the Peninsulares, right? So they're fully Spanish, right? They're both parents are Spanish. They would be light-skinned, but they are born. The only difference is they are born in North or South America. They are born on the western side of the Atlantic Ocean. So they don't get the highest jobs. They get jobs within the empire, right? They become governor, they become high merchants, and they become maybe tax officials, right? But they don't get the highest jobs. Below them are mixed race, right? So there's mestizos, comes from the word mezcla. This would be a Spanish parent, a descendant or somebody with some Spanish blood marrying and having children with an Indian noble princess. Right, and that relationship would produce, right, somebody who is a little bit higher in social status, right? They might have artisan jobs, they might be shop owners, again, decently well off, but not rich. Below them are the mulattoes. This would be a person with Spanish blood and a person of African descent. These people would have, these children would have, again, trades jobs, but again, they wouldn't own the shops. They would be apprentices. They would be people who have some sort of skilled labor, but not the highest forms of skilled labor. And then finally, below them are the Native Americans and the African slaves. What you'll notice here is that there is a lot of intermarriage, and the reason is because there's so few women being brought across the Atlantic Ocean. For the most part, it is Spanish men who are making the journey, and they are intermarrying with Native American women, African women, because of the lack of brides who are of Spanish descent. Ultimately, the treatment of Native Americans, the massive death of Native Americans leads to, and these are some images here of the treatment of Native Americans at the hands of the Spanish. And this ultimately leads to the desire and the need for the African slave trade. And we're going to talk more about the African slave trade in a week or two, so I will hold off till then. The place where we want to end today is the way in which the crown responds. After Bartolome de las Casas writes his book on the devastation of the Indies, the Spanish king, the Spanish emperor, who is Charles V, and we'll talk a lot about Charles V. He's also the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He passes a law called the New Law for the Indies. And in this law, he advocates the better treatment of Native Americans. However, the law gives the people involved a lot of latitude, right? So it basically says Native Americans must be treated well, it must be taken care of. However, in order to do that, the person in charge, who is called a hidalgo, would be in charge of Christianizing and protecting those people and providing them food, right? So it basically becomes slavery, just by another name, right? Because they're being taken care of, but there's also this sort of Christian aspect to it, indoctrination aspect to it. So what you can see happening here, right, over the course of 100 or 100 and so years, right, that the desire for God, gold, and glory, conversion, and economic output leads to awful treatment of Native Americans and the increase of and the demand for African slaves to be traded.